Monsters are real, and ghosts are real too. They live inside us, and sometimes they win. That quote by Stephen King is not just horror fiction. It's a haunting reflection of something deeper, something psychological. This journey begins with one terrifying realization. The line between good and evil is not a line at all. It's a shadow, and it lives inside every human being. You may not see it, but it's there, in the thoughts you bury, in the desires you deny, in the anger you suppress when no one is watching. What if I told you that the first step to understanding evil is to recognize how close it is to you? This is where the dark psychology of evil begins, not in the mind of a villain from fiction, but in your own reflection. You, me, and everyone we know, we all carry what Carl Jung called the shadow self, a hidden part of the psyche that contains our most primitive, aggressive, and shameful impulses. Jung believed that if you do not face your shadow, it will control you from within, and you'll mistake its voice for your own. This isn't just philosophy. Modern psychology supports it. When we repress our darkest emotions, rage, envy, cruelty, they don't disappear, they evolve. One of the foundations of dark psychology is that what you hide becomes what you become. In everyday life, this shows up in passive-aggressive behavior, emotional manipulation, and moral double standards. The ones who claim to be most righteous often carry the deepest hatred, and they don't even know it. Let me ask you something personal. Have you ever smiled when someone else failed, or ignored someone's suffering because you didn't want to get involved? Did you ever wish something bad would happen, but told yourself it was just a passing thought? That is the psychology of evil in its quietest form. The dark psychology of evil doesn't need a villain's mask or a dramatic crime. Sometimes it looks like ordinary indifference. Sometimes it's the absence of empathy. Consider the concept of moral disengagement. Psychologist Albert Bandura explained how people justify harmful behavior by changing how they think about it. We sanitize violence with words like necessary evil or collateral damage. We blame victims to avoid guilt. We convince ourselves we're the heroes of our story, even when we're causing harm. This is how someone can hurt another person and still sleep at night. The dark psychology behind such behavior isn't just about what people do. It's about how they think, how they feel, how they justify. And once this process becomes automatic, the line between right and wrong blurs. What once felt unthinkable becomes acceptable. It starts small, a lie told to protect your image, a cruel word said in private, a rule broken when no one is watching. And with each act, your mind adapts. It adjusts its definition of good, and over time, you lose the ability to feel guilt. Here's where it gets disturbing. Studies on psychopathy and sociopathy show that many individuals who commit dark acts don't believe they're evil. They believe they're right, that they're doing what's necessary, that the world made them this way. You might wonder, is evil something we choose or something we become without knowing? The dark psychology of evil is not only about the monsters in history, it's about the whispers in your own mind. It's about the part of you that feels justified in hurting others, especially when you're hurt yourself. And this is why understanding your shadow matters, because without that awareness, it controls you. Without facing it, you feed it. And without reflection, you risk becoming what you fear. So the next time you look in the mirror, don't just search for your best qualities. Ask yourself, what darkness are you hiding, and what would it take to set it free? Are people born evil, or do they learn to become that way? This question sits at the center of moral psychology and at the heart of dark psychology. It is the dilemma that continues to trouble scientists, philosophers, and every person who has ever looked into the eyes of a criminal and asked, why? You might wonder this too, when you see someone commit a horrific act, murder, betrayal, deception. What was the cause? Were they destined for it from birth, or were they shaped, bent and twisted by their environment? The dark psychology of evil doesn't offer easy answers, but it does provide clues, hidden in genetics, childhood, trauma, and brain chemistry. Let's begin with nature. Some individuals are born with traits that correlate with reduced empathy, increased aggression, and a hunger for dominance. These traits form what psychologists call the dark triad: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. Not everyone with these traits becomes evil. but the pattern is hard to ignore. Studies on the MAOA gene, nicknamed the warrior gene, suggest that some brains process threats differently. Individuals with this genetic variation often show a lower threshold for violence when triggered. Their emotional brakes don't function the same. They feel less remorse, less fear, less empathy. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Genetics are not fate. Environment matters. In fact, research has shown that people with these dangerous traits, who are raised in nurturing, supportive environments, are far less likely to become dangerous. Now consider the opposite. A child exposed to abuse, neglect, humiliation, or chronic fear may develop deep emotional scars. These scars do not always fade with time. Instead, they can calcify into something darker: resentment, cruelty, and emotional detachment. In the most extreme cases, a desire to make others feel the pain they once endured. Have you ever known someone who seemed hollow inside, not broken but empty, like the light behind their eyes had dimmed long ago? That emptiness often begins in childhood, and it grows silently beneath the surface. This is why the psychology of evil cannot be reduced to DNA. It's not just about birth, it's about development. It's about the brain learning or failing to learn what it means to be human. When a child never sees kindness, compassion becomes foreign. When a young person is rewarded for cruelty, empathy becomes weakness. Over time, their moral compass bends, and sometimes it shatters entirely. But this raises another uncomfortable question. What about you? If you had been born into their world with their parents, their trauma, their brain, could you have ended up the same? It's easy to judge the wicked, much harder to admit that under different conditions, you might have joined them. That's the terrifying truth behind dark psychology. The mind is not born pure, it is programmable. Even small acts of rejection or isolation, repeated often enough, can alter a person's entire worldview. They begin to believe the world is hostile, that no one will protect them, that the only way to survive is to hurt first, before being hurt. And in time, this defensive mindset becomes a default one. They lie without guilt, manipulate without hesitation, harm without remorse. The dark psychology of evil reminds us that wickedness is rarely sudden. It is shaped slowly by thousands of invisible wounds, twisted beliefs, and unchecked desires, each one a small step further away from innocence. So next time you ask yourself, what makes someone truly wicked? Try asking something else too. What would I have become if life had broken me differently? Because the difference between good and evil is not always moral strength. Sometimes it's simply circumstance. Let's explore what happens when ordinary people, people who seem just like you, are placed in extraordinary situations, and how, under the right conditions, the psychology of evil doesn't just live in monsters, it lives in crowds. You probably believe you're a good person. Most people do. But here's a chilling thought. What if goodness isn't something fixed inside you, but something shaped by where you stand, who you follow, and what rules you obey? This is the unsettling truth behind the dark psychology of evil. You don't need to be born cruel. You just need the right or the wrong environment. In 1961, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram ran an experiment that would change how we understand obedience forever. Participants were told to deliver electric shocks to a stranger, simply because a man in a lab coat instructed them to do it. Most complied. They continued, even when they believed the other person was screaming in pain. Why? Because they were told to. Milgram's study wasn't just about obedience. It revealed how ordinary people under pressure can commit terrible acts without feeling evil. They were not sadists. They were not psychopaths. They were people like you, people who followed orders. This is where dark psychology becomes dangerous, not in villains, but in systems. A decade later, another shocking experiment echoed this theme. At Stanford University, Philip Zimbardo created a simulated prison. Volunteers were assigned roles, guards or prisoners. Within days, the guards became brutal. The prisoners broke down mentally. The simulation had to be stopped early. Zimbardo called this the Lucifer effect. How good people can become wicked when placed in roles of power, anonymity, and control. What would you have done if you were there? The psychology of evil teaches us that moral collapse is often gradual. No one wakes up and says, "Today I will be cruel." But given the right script, the right costume, and the right justification, even kindness can decay. This is not just theory. History is filled with real examples. Genocides, purges, institutional abuses. Many were carried out by people who claimed they were just doing their job. Bureaucrats, soldiers, clerks, people who had families, hobbies, prayers, and routines. Yet they became instruments of suffering. Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil, the idea that true wickedness doesn't always come with rage or madness. Sometimes it wears a uniform and punches a clock. It hides behind routine. So ask yourself this: how many of your actions are based on your conscience, and how many are shaped by obedience, tradition, or fear of standing out? This is the trap of conformity psychology. You see others doing something harmful, and you stay silent, or worse, you join in, because silence feels safer than resistance. In social psychology, this is known as de-individuation, when people in groups lose their sense of self, and along with it, their moral compass. Mob behavior, online bullying, cancel culture. In these moments, people don't feel personally responsible, so they let their darker impulses speak. Here's where dark psychology creeps in again. When someone stops feeling like an individual, they can hurt others without guilt. When everyone is responsible, no one is. This isn't just about extreme cases. You've seen it before, in classrooms, in workplaces, in families. One voice rises, and others follow, sometimes to uplift, but sometimes to destroy. How many times have you said nothing, even when you knew something was wrong? That silence is not neutral. In the realm of dark psychology, silence can be a weapon. It protects the aggressor, it abandons the victim, and it erodes the soul of the one who stays quiet. The dark psychology of evil isn't always loud. Sometimes it sounds like laughter when someone is humiliated, or footsteps walking away when someone is crying, or a button pressed just because someone in a white coat said so. That's what makes this topic so terrifying. Evil doesn't need monsters, it just needs permission. So ask yourself, not who you are in times of peace, but who you would be in times of pressure. Would you follow orders? Would you stay silent? Or would you see the darkness rising and choose to stop it? Let's examine mob psychology, groupthink, and the frightening speed at which morality dissolves when crowds gather and fear takes hold. When a crowd moves, it feels powerful. When it roars, it feels righteous. But when it turns cruel, it becomes something else, something primal, blind, and dangerous. This is where dark psychology transforms from an internal force to a contagious one. It spreads from mind to mind, infecting judgment, rewriting morality, and silencing the voice of reason. And once it takes root in a group, the line between right and wrong doesn't just blur, it disappears. You've probably seen it before: online mobs, tearing someone apart with words, groups turning on outsiders in the name of justice, people cheering while another person is humiliated. Maybe you've even participated without realizing what was happening. This is not just a social problem, it's a psychological one. The psychology of evil becomes far more volatile when it enters a group. It loses its face, it loses its name, and it becomes collective. Psychologist Gustave Le Bon once warned about the crowd mind. In groups, people think less, question less, and feel less guilt. The individual becomes submerged in the collective, and with that, responsibility fades. This is known as de-individuation, a key mechanism in dark psychology of evil. It allows people to do things they would never do alone, because they don't feel like it's really them doing it. But why does this happen? Why do people act more cruelly in groups? Part of the answer lies in social identity theory. You define yourself by the groups you belong to, your nationality, your religion, your political tribe, and once you've chosen a side, protecting the group often becomes more important than protecting your values. This is how moral panic begins. A threat is announced, real or imagined. The group feels fear. That fear turns to anger, and that anger demands an outlet, someone to blame, someone to punish. The media, the internet, and even education systems can amplify this process. Narratives are simplified, enemies are created, and soon the public is no longer thinking, they're reacting. You've probably felt it too, that pressure to agree, to conform, to not speak up when the crowd moves in one direction, even when your gut tells you something is off. That pressure is part of the dark psychology of group behavior. It silences dissent, it rewards obedience, and it makes cruelty feel like loyalty. Consider witch hunts, consider public executions in ancient times, or digital cancellations today. The methods change, but the psychology remains. People feel empowered when their cruelty is socially approved. Have you ever shared a harsh post because it felt like justice? Have you liked a comment that shamed someone without knowing the full story? Did it feel good, even for a moment? That feeling is not just emotion, it's psychological reinforcement. The brain releases dopamine when we feel righteous, even if the behavior is harmful. In that moment, evil becomes pleasurable. That's why dark psychology of evil is so dangerous in crowds. It doesn't just spread, it rewards you for participating. It also creates a false sense of certainty. You stop questioning your actions because everyone around you is doing the same. You stop reflecting because the noise is louder than your conscience. But here's the question: what if the crowd is wrong? What if the people you're punishing are innocent? What if the fear you feel was planted, manipulated, or exaggerated? Would you stop? Would you speak up? Or would you stay quiet, afraid to be next? This is the moral test of group behavior. It's not about how you act when you're alone. It's about who you become when others are watching and cheering. The psychology of evil thrives in places where individuality dies, where people stop thinking, where punishment becomes entertainment. The solution isn't isolation, it's awareness. Awareness that mobs can lie, that fear can be manufactured, that popular doesn't always mean right. When belief becomes absolute, when righteousness becomes weaponized, and when dark psychology hides behind the mask of virtue, some of the darkest acts in history were committed by people who believed they were doing good. This is one of the most chilling insights of dark psychology, that evil doesn't always know it's evil. Sometimes it wears a white robe, speaks with holy conviction, and believes it is saving the world. This is the dark psychology of evil, at its most deceptive, when cruelty is not just justified, but glorified, when harm is done, not in secrecy, but in the light of belief, and when belief becomes so absolute that no doubt, no dissent, no humanity can survive it. Have you ever believed something so deeply that nothing could shake it? Have you ever felt morally superior to someone else because you knew your side was right? That certainty, that righteousness, it feels powerful, but it's also dangerous. This is where moral absolutism begins, the belief that your values, your truth, your worldview is not just better, but the only one that matters. From this perspective, anyone who disagrees is not just wrong, they are evil. And if they are evil, then anything done to stop them becomes justified. That's how ideologies turn toxic. History is filled with examples, from religious inquisitions to political purges to modern extremist movements. In each case, violence was not committed out of hatred alone, but out of belief, a belief that the ends justified the means. This is not just philosophy, it's applied psychology. Studies in cognitive dissonance show that when people harm others for a cause they believe in, they are more likely to double down rather than feel guilt. They rewrite their memories, they reframe their motives, and slowly their conscience disappears. The psychology of evil becomes more entrenched when belief is used as a shield. Once someone becomes certain that their mission is noble, they stop questioning their methods, they silence criticism, they demonize opposition, and they start to see cruelty as duty. This kind of righteousness is seductive. It simplifies the world into good and bad, us and them, right and wrong. It gives people identity, purpose, and power, but it also erases empathy. Have you ever argued with someone who refused to listen, who shut down every question with moral outrage, who didn't want a conversation, only a victory? That is what dark psychology does to belief. It radicalizes it. The internet has only made this worse. Algorithms feed you content that confirms your opinions. Online tribes reward anger, punish nuance, and elevate those who speak the loudest, not the wisest. Echo chambers form, and inside them, everyone feels like the hero. But step outside that bubble, and you'll see the same thing on the other side. Another group, just as certain, just as angry, just as convinced they're fighting evil. So who's right? That's not the point. The point is that ideological evil does not depend on the truth of a cause. It depends on the methods used to defend it. When a belief, no matter how noble, justifies cruelty, it becomes corrupted. This is why dark psychology of evil hides so well behind virtue. Because no one suspects the righteous, no one questions the hero, and few people want to admit that they might be the villain in someone else's story. So ask yourself, what do you believe in so fiercely that you'd ignore harm done in its name? What would you tolerate or stay silent about if it helped your cause win? That is where your shadow lives. The psychology of evil isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers through pride, sometimes it marches in protest, sometimes it prays, and sometimes it smiles, believing it's doing God's work. What happens after the harm is done? Can someone who has chosen cruelty find their way back? Or are their acts so dark, so destructive, that redemption becomes impossible? This is where dark psychology meets something even more complicated: human change. The question of whether evil can be unlearned is not just moral, it is deeply psychological, and perhaps it is also personal. You've likely heard stories of transformation, former criminals who now work to stop violence, extremists who have walked away from hate, abusers who finally saw the truth in what they had done. But how real is that change? Can someone truly rebuild a conscience that once collapsed? In dark psychology of evil, the path to transformation is fragile. Once someone crosses the line between empathy and apathy, they often forget what it feels like to care. Their brain adapts, their emotional reflexes shut down, guilt becomes distant, shame turns into silence, and the idea of change feels naive. Yet, there are cracks in that wall. Psychologists who study restorative justice have found something profound. People who confront their actions face to face, who listen to victims, who feel the weight of what they've done, often begin to shift. Not all, not quickly, but some. It turns out that empathy, even damaged empathy, can sometimes be rekindled. The psychology of evil suggests that wickedness is not always permanent. It is often a learned pattern, a defense mechanism, or a belief system wrapped in pain. And just as the mind can be trained to harm, it can be retrained to heal. But there's a catch. That change only begins when someone chooses to look inward. And here's the hardest part of that journey. It starts with guilt. Real guilt, not public shame, not punishment, not fear of consequence, but the deep, private realization: I caused harm, I was wrong. Dark psychology often prevents that realization. It builds walls of rationalization. It tells the mind, you did what you had to. It says they deserved it. It protects the ego at all costs. Breaking that mental armor requires more than therapy. It requires courage. Have you ever admitted something that made you feel ashamed? Have you ever looked someone in the eye and said, I hurt you, without defending yourself? That moment is terrifying, but it's also the beginning of change. One of the most moving examples comes from former extremists who now speak against hate. Many say the same thing. They didn't stop believing the ideology at first. They just started building human connections. They met the people they were told to hate. They heard their stories, and slowly the hatred cracked. This is the power of psychology of evil when it begins to reverse. It does not erase the past, but it rewires the mind. It challenges old beliefs. It softens the self-image that once stood above empathy. But not everyone can walk this road, and not everyone wants to. Some people cling to the identity they've built, because without it, they feel nothing. Others fear judgment more than change, and some simply never see the need. So can all evil be unlearned? The answer is, not always, but sometimes. And that sometimes matters. Because if change is possible, then so is hope. Then justice becomes more than punishment. Then healing becomes something both sides can reach toward. The dark psychology of evil teaches us how people fall, but it also teaches us that falling is not always the end. So ask yourself, if someone truly faced what they've done, if they truly changed, could you forgive them? Would you want them to have a second chance? Or would you rather believe that evil never changes, so you don't have to? We're going to turn the mirror fully around, because while we often look for evil in others, the truth is, some of its quietest forms live in our own daily choices. When you hear the word evil, you may imagine extremes, serial killers, dictators, abusers, terrorists. But what if I told you that evil doesn't always arrive with fire and fury? What if it's already around you? What if it's already inside you? This is where dark psychology turns inward, away from monsters and toward mirrors. Most people do not commit crimes. Most do not torture, murder, or terrorize. Yet most people have, at some point, caused harm. Not through malice, but through silence. Not by striking, but by turning away. That's the terrifying truth behind the psychology of evil. It is not only built by grand actions, it is also shaped by omissions, small acts of cruelty, everyday neglect. Have you ever ignored someone's pain because it was inconvenient, laughed when someone was humiliated, chose to say nothing while watching someone else suffer? You might call these things normal, but normal is not the same as good. Dark psychology of evil shows us that wickedness often hides in the mundane, in the tiny fractures of empathy, in the choices we justify as not my problem. These are called moral blind spots, parts of your character you do not question because they feel routine, but over time they calcify, and they begin to shape your identity without your awareness. Think about gossip, think about envy, think about moments when you secretly celebrated someone's failure. Did you feel a spark of satisfaction? A sense of victory? That feeling, no matter how small, is part of the machinery. The dark psychology of emotional cruelty runs on those tiny sparks. It thrives in environments where people reward subtle harm. Even more alarming is how social roles enable it. When someone is labeled as inferior because of their background, beliefs, or flaws, it becomes easier to treat them as less than human. You withdraw empathy. You stop seeing their pain as real. You become comfortable with their suffering. This is known as empathic numbing. It's the gradual shutdown of emotional sensitivity, and it's one of the key principles in the psychology of evil, not just for murderers, but for everyday people, people who decide quietly that some lives matter less than others. Have you ever told yourself, they deserve it, not out of reason, but out of resentment? That mindset is a warning sign. Dark psychology of evil warns us that we don't need to hate someone to harm them. We just need to stop caring, or to believe we're better, or to think our discomfort matters more than their dignity. It also teaches us how easily we excuse ourselves. You yell because you're tired. You manipulate because you're protecting yourself. You ghost someone because explaining would be too hard. Each excuse makes the action feel smaller, but collectively, they build patterns. And those patterns define you. You're not being asked to be perfect. That's not the point. The point is to be conscious. Because dark psychology becomes dangerous when it's unconscious, when people stop asking why they do what they do, when they blame the world but never examine themselves. So what now? Ask yourself, when was the last time you truly reflected on the harm you've caused, even unintentionally? When was the last time you apologized without defending yourself? When did you choose empathy over ego? These are not small questions. They are acts of resistance. Resistance against the subtle everyday currents that pull all of us toward indifference. Because the real danger is not just in those who commit evil. It is in those who tolerate it, justify it, ignore it. And that includes you. The dark psychology of evil is not about pointing fingers. It's about holding a mirror, not to shame, but to awaken. We often crave simple answers, good versus evil, right versus wrong, heroes and villains. But the truth, psychologically, philosophically, is far more complex. The final lesson of dark psychology is this: no one is only one thing. We are capable of both immense compassion and quiet cruelty. Light and shadow live side by side in every human soul. So where does that leave you? If you've followed this journey, you've already seen the dangers, the way ordinary people can become instruments of harm, the way beliefs can blind and fear can spread, the way silence can protect injustice, and how the dark psychology of evil hides not just in others, but in the everyday choices you make. It may feel overwhelming. You might wonder, how do I stay good in a world that's so broken? How do I make sure I don't become what I hate? The answer isn't perfection, it's presence. The most powerful weapon against the psychology of evil is awareness. Awareness of your impulses, awareness of your justifications, awareness of the subtle shifts in your thinking that over time become your actions. Evil doesn't start with cruelty. It starts with convenience, with looking away, with telling yourself a story that makes you feel innocent. But just as you can choose to close your eyes, you can also choose to open them. That's what dark psychology ultimately reveals. Not just what makes people dangerous, but what makes them free. Free to resist their shadows, free to choose conscience over conformity, free to stand still in a rushing crowd and say no. Have you ever been that person? Have you ever stood up when it would have been easier to sit down? Have you ever spoken truth, even when it shook your voice? If so, you've already faced your darkness, and you didn't let it win. Because the real question is not whether evil exists. It does. The real question is what you do when you recognize it, not just in history or in others, but in yourself. Philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once warned, whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. That warning is still true today. In every fight for justice, every debate, every belief, you must ask, am I protecting goodness or feeding my ego? Because righteousness is a mask evil loves to wear. So what do you do now? You choose. You choose to think when others react, to feel when others numb, to reflect when others judge. You choose to ask the hard questions, not about them, but about you. What kind of person do you become under pressure? How do you treat someone who has nothing to offer you? Who do you become when no one is watching? These questions are not meant to shame you. They're meant to guide you. Because dark psychology of evil does not define your fate. It reveals your potential for harm, yes, but also for healing, for responsibility, for change. So don't fear your shadow. Face it. Don't deny your dark thoughts. Understand them. Don't assume you're always on the right side. Question it. And in doing so, you will become something rare, not flawless, not pure, but awake. The psychology of evil shows us the worst of humanity, but it also shows us the best, not in the absence of darkness, but in the ability to move through it and still choose the light. So ask yourself one final time, not who you are today, but who you're becoming, with every word you say, every choice you make, every silence you break. Because evil doesn't win through one great act. It wins when good people look away. And today you didn't.